Were you aware that while Mr. Zuckerberg was building the Facebook, he was leading the plaintiffs to believe he was building Harvard Connection?
You're offering a conclusion not found in evidence.
We are about to find it in evidence.
The montage is one of the most popular and enthralling techniques used in filmmaking. It is also one of the laziest. When done without purpose, it becomes a paltry attempt at swiftly moving the story forward and tends to fall flat. But when done right, it can culminate in something that feels transcendent, something musical, something magical. The Social Network is one such case. As a film and artifact of popular culture, it has been dissected in every possible way. A lot of this has to do with what should be the dictionary definition of the perfect storm. The marriage of individual components in the creation of this film was so perfect, it's hard to imagine a more fitting amalgam of elements to dissect and analyze. The montage in question here serves as sort of a microcosm of that perfect melding of elements. It should be noted that this film contains perhaps multiple impeccable montages. What we're interested in today is the Intriguing Possibilities montage, aptly named after the track and the score that plays throughout. Why don't we start there? Intriguing Possibilities. The themes of the film are many and varied, and we all know the eventual fate of Facebook. But for the characters in the moment, this was a time of new avenues, interesting opportunities, and intriguing possibilities. The montage begins when, in a deposition, the Winklevoss's lawyer begins to describe the sequence of events detailing Mark Zuckerberg's deception. More specifically, the deception of the twins regarding their social media site's development. The content of the montage can be broken down into three primary elements: Mark Zuckerberg getting further in his development of the Facebook, Eduardo Saverin inching further in his pursuit to join a final club, and the Winklevoss twins falling further into the deceit of Mark Zuckerberg. These core elements of the montage essentially form the core conflicts of the film itself, and the effectiveness of the film's narrative relies on how well these elements intertwine and affect each other. Mark developing the Facebook affects Eduardo because Eduardo is also the co-founder. Despite being a 30% partner, he's always kept at an arm's length in the process, signaling Mark's belief that he knows better.
Do we need it? Gotta handle the traffic.
Do it.
I already did. No idea what that's gonna mean to my father. Sure I do.
And while he technically does know better about the practical implementation of a scalable web application, that hubris will bleed into his decision-making on other matters further down the road. Eduardo being in contention for a spot in the Phoenix Club affects Mark because, well, ego. Mark's insatiable desire to get into a final club is made clear in the opening scene of the film, and Eduardo having the opportunity to get into one brings on a feeling of inadequacy. We see this right before the montage and within it as well.
Hey, guess what? I made the second cut. That's good. You should be proud of that right there. Don't worry if you don't make it any further. It probably was a diversity thing. But so what?
Why do you think he said that?
They're suggesting I was jealous of Eduardo for getting punched by the Phoenix and began a plan to screw him out of a company I hadn't even invented yet.
Were you?
Gretchen. Jealous of Eduardo.
The montage essentially plants the seeds for the impending rift in their friendship. Perhaps this subdued jealousy makes Sean Parker's suggestion to cut out Eduardo all the much easier to accept. Mark developing the Facebook affects the Winklevoss twins because it is the very thing he is purposely deceiving them about. Whether he stole their idea is up for debate, but it is fairly evident that what the Facebook becomes has an eerie similarity to the twins' Harvard connection idea, and his misleading messages and emails are meant to mask his intention of building his own version of the site. But why lead them down this path only to later tell them that he's skeptical of the site's practicality? Well, that could be because he wants a head start in the launch of his version of the website, but if he truly believes that they possess different ideas, then he wouldn't be competing with them anyway. So what is the deal here? Again, I think we can trace this back to hubris. Eduardo mentions in his testimony that Mark resents the idea that the twins thought that he needed his image rehabilitated.
This could help rehabilitate your image.
Wow. You would do that for me.
They were also part of the Porcellian Final Club, an aspirational feat for Mark. Add to the fact his strange obsession with the idea of rowing crew.
Nothing
I could
wrong.
row crew or invent a $25 PC.
On the other hand, I do like guys who row crew.
Well, I can't do that. Well, they're bigger than me. They're world-class athletes. And a second ago, you said you like guys who row crew, so I assumed you had met one.
We wrote crew.
Yeah, I've got a minute.
Perhaps it makes it all the much simpler to designate the twins as enemies. It's possible that he sees these insecurities of his all personified in the twins, and thinks he can outdo them in an attempt to prove his superiority. It is likely that he knows he's taking heavy inspiration from their idea, and he's purposely deceitful because he thinks he can get away with it. He thinks he can have it all. Only later on will he realize that there are limits to his debauchery. That's what makes this montage great. Each shot serves a purpose that will later be fulfilled overtly or in a subtextual manner in the rest of the film. But there is one thing, perhaps a cardinal offense in what may be considered the codified theory of filmmaking: narration. Because of the inherently visual nature of film, we are often told for films to show rather than tell. Narration is often scoffed at for being redundant in relaying the story. But what we learn from watching decades of film is that as long as you execute something well enough, there aren't really any hard set rules. And the so-called rules that do exist, you're allowed to break them if you have a good enough reason. So let's talk about Aaron Sorkin. A Few Good Men, The West Wing, Moneyball, Steve Jobs. His credentials as a screenwriter very clearly exemplify his versatility. He doesn't need to be immediately well versed with the subject matter to know that all stories are essentially human stories. I don't bring up these past scripts to say that his previous merit is enough to make this film meritful, but to outline the various methods he uses to convey a message. These methods tend to repeat themselves in one way or another. For example, a good chunk of The Social Network could be described as a court story, much like his breakthrough script for A Few Good Men. Litigation tends to fit well with his style of quick-fire dialogue. The cross-cutting montage that is in question here has been a staple in almost all of his works, but most clearly seen in The West Wing, his television magnum opus. The infamous walk and talk is likely what most people think of as a token Sorkinism, but the cross-cutting montage is present throughout the show as well, most notably in the Season 2 episode Noel. Similar to the Winklevoss's lawyer narrating the montage in this scene, in The West Wing we have Josh Lyman narrating his experiences to a therapist. What makes these montages interesting in particular is that a story is being told audibly through narration, as well as visually with the relevant scenes shown on screen. And while what is being spoken is technically narration, it's rarely dialogue. It's a conversation between people describing events, but instead of solely seeing the conversation itself, you also see what the conversation is describing, a further layer of immersion. Regardless, this may feel redundant since just being shown the visual should be sufficient to infer what is occurring. But it's important to understand that what is being spoken is what the narrator believes is occurring. Why is that? Because the climax of the episode reveals that Josh is bottling up trauma from a previous event and recalling the events incorrectly. We then see the actual sequence of events take place on screen. What this establishes to the viewer is that Josh was an unreliable narrator, and just because we are shown something on screen doesn't mean it actually happened. There are times a scene would be better suited solely relying on the visual element, but this doesn't rule out the possibility or necessity of the scene containing some form of an auditory element. In the case of The Social Network, because we're in the midst of a deposition, we expect exact detail to be relayed from the participants. Or, as we see in the case with The West Wing, at least their perceived recollection of events. Now, whether the deposition scene is intended to have a level of unreliability is up for debate, but if we take into account this line from Rashida Jones's lawyer character towards the end of the film,
I'm not a bad guy.
I know that. When there's emotional testimony, I assume 85% of it is exaggeration.
And the other 15?
Perjury. Creation myths need a devil.
this clip gives us a hint about the authenticity of the statements in the context of the film. Perhaps it's a metatextual reference to how the film itself is detached from the reality of the creation of Facebook. It's more likely that having a court reading of the events just seemed more dramatic and a better choice for the scene, but it is an interesting line to include as it casts a doubt on what we believe to have occurred. Another vital part of the narration/dialogue working in the scene is the manner in which it is shot and executed. As the director, David Fincher has his hands in many pots. Whether it be arguing with Sorkin about how certain scenes should play out, or conversing with the composers about which type of piano should be used for the main melody, to call him a perfectionist would be a massive understatement. But as he and the director of photography Jeff Cronenweth mentioned in the behind the scenes, much of the film's effectiveness relies on letting the script do the heavy lifting.
One of the challenges of this movie was that the script is so dialogue driven that we had to let the dialogue be the hero of the movie, and therefore we kind of took an unassuming approach to the visual style.
You know, you got a 5-page scene where a guy's in a club and he's trying to seduce another character, And you could put on a Steadicam and you could spin around that table and you could do a lot of stuff. But really the important thing is to watch Jesse Eisenberg's face as he listens, because the listening is more than half of that conversation.
Fincher knows that several of the scenes would be better suited just focusing on the conversation. When the dialogue works this well, why try to execute some technical marvel that takes away from it? It's always a strange thing when you have to surmise whether the director or screenwriter holds more weight for the excellence of a film, but in terms of this montage, you can clearly see Sorkin had basically mapped the whole sequence out in the original screenplay. This wasn't a case of a director making a choice in the edit, rather this was Fincher's decision-making and restraint that elevated the script into becoming something masterful. The montage doesn't contain many camera shots that would take attention away from the scene. Much of what we see are medium shots that are either static or following the character, sweeping pans that establish the setting that the character is in, or static wide shots that encompass the surroundings. But what is simple to see is that the characters and their actions are always the focus. The characters are almost always either dead center or in one of the thirds of the frame. There's no flex from the director here. Fincher's creative framing, or more specifically money shots, are fairly limited throughout this film compared to the rest of his filmography, save for the rowing scene. The montage is clearly driven by the dialogue, and Fincher rightfully puts a spotlight on it. On the topic of elevating the surrounding material, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's score for the film has been anointed as historic both in its execution and genesis. To come in to write a film score with little to no experience and then going on to win the Oscar is the stuff of legends. But how does the intriguing possibilities track fit into this montage? Some background with Trent Reznor's previous work is required to understand this. Reznor's music with Nine Inch Nails can be classified as raw, industrial, and electronic. The use of ambient-like noise is frequent in his discography. It is perhaps this quality, among others, that gave Nine Inch Nails the label of industrial rock. What may usually be relegated as background noise is often made part of the experience in his work.
Hurt myself today.
That is a continued theme with the score in The Social Network. Sometimes a theme will start with what sounds like static before the melody kicks in, and sometimes the melody and the ambient-like noise will rise at different speeds and collide to a crescendo, something that can only be described as a cacophonous symphony. In the track that plays throughout the montage, we hear an electronic melody. The static-like sound increases throughout, but it arrives in full form right when the tension is extremely palpable.
I'm in the second cut.
That's good. You should be proud of that right there. Don't worry if you don't make it any further.
I'll get out of here.
The ambient-like noise has a natural quality that induces anxiety and builds tension as the volume rises. And on a subjective note, the music really does feel like it is built into something aspirational, just as Mark and Eduardo are advancing further in their respective worlds. Here are Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross working through a scene and describing their experimentation.
Now we've got some sense moving through the noise into uncomfortable but melodic.
Wanted it to feel like it's moving from a disjointed series of tape loops into cohesiveness starts to form.
I love music where it's like a jigsaw of pieces that fit together and that the mood can radically transform when it started out sounded angry and weird.
The Social Network exists as a film that will reveal more as the years go on. The ever-changing discourse around Facebook makes sure that the text of The Social Network will always be relevant, whether it's through the things it warned us about, or the things that haven't happened yet. This montage, in an archetypal fashion, executes with a clear purpose in mind and therefore becomes an essential storytelling element for the film. It simultaneously establishes character motivations all while executing the artistic elements of filmmaking at the highest level. Now we have the actors, the screenwriter, the director, the DP, the composers, all existing on the most rare of creative planes. All these individual pieces, which were excellent on their own, came together and collaborated to form a more perfect whole, just as this montage contributes as a vital piece to the rest of the film.